This is Guitar Business Radio, the podcast for the business of guitar. No reviews, no demos, no idle chatter, just useful dialogue and information to help you get the most out of your guitar-related business. Whether you're a guitar builder or a guitar player or just something in between, this is for you. Now, here's your host. Oh, wait, it's me, Jeffrey D. Brown. So let's get to it. Welcome to episode 1 of Guitar Business Radio. It starts here. We're not sure where this will all end up or even how we're going to get there. There's one thing for sure, though, that we can count on, and that's change. This podcast will change over time. Whether you call it evolution, reinvention, trial and error, it's going to happen. It's a natural process, and my sense is we'll be tweaking this as we go. So I'm really looking at this as kind of a journey. But it's just a segment of a larger journey that's been going on for a long time. So it makes sense that we're going to be looking at the business of guitar that has also been going on for a long time. There's a lot to learn and know and take in. It won't be just a snapshot of today's world, although I would expect that to be a good chunk of the conversation. So in thinking about how we're going to structure the podcast, looking at what content ought to be, I wanted to try to involve as many voices as I possibly could. Now, for sure, we'll be bringing you in-depth interviews with a good variety of people in the business and in different aspects of the business: builders, sellers, players, others with a direct connection to the world of guitar. And in that light, we'll be talking today with a very well-respected guitar builder that, frankly, I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. I'm talking about Mark Lacey in Nashville. He's also been around a long time, and he'll be giving us some really interesting perspective on his experience in the business. So we'll get to that in just a few moments. In addition, I want to expand a bit on what I said about adding as many voices as possible to the podcast. Since we do have some time constraints, we can only do so many full interviews, but I decided to come up with several other ways to add more folks to the mix. So we created a section on the website, guitarbusinessradio.com, and it's called, appropriately enough, Participate. There, we outline a handful of ways that you can easily interact with the show. I mentioned some of those in the trailer if you haven't listened to that, but here's some more detail. First, we want to provide answers to your questions as best we can. This may be beneficial to you, but it also helps other listeners, and that's really what we're all about. So you can submit questions either on the webpage or through spoken word, if you like, on our Guitar Business Radio hotline. Obviously not a very original term, but a better one escapes me at the moment. One of the things that we hope to feature a lot of is our Guitar Business Minute segments. This is your opportunity to literally add your voice to the mix. You can record these little segments yourself and submit them to us, and we'll play as many as we can, and I hope there's many. You can record them on your phone or computer and send them to us, or again, you can call our hotline at 877-228-4703 and press 2, and then you can leave it there. If we use it, we'll do our best to make it sound great on the show. Also, we want to hear about any relevant news that you might have or know about. There's a difference. And you can tell us about that easily on the website or on the hotline. And finally, if you'd like to recommend a possible interview for us, yourself or someone else, you can do that. Bottom line, we want to hear from you, and we want you to be part of Guitar Business Radio. So in future episodes, you're going to hear more about what I just described. It does take time, especially for a brand new show like this, to ramp that kind of stuff up, but we'll see what happens. That's the fun part of this, that it's kind of a organic thing and may develop a life of its own. That's okay. Most of the time, we don't really know how life is going to unfold, and that's the same thing here. But I think if you keep your eye on the destination in general, you usually get to a place of equal or greater value, as long as you stay out of the way. And I may have more to say about that at another time, but first, so this is the segment we call Questionable Moments. It's where you get to ask us questions, and we answer them, either because we know the answer or because we know someone who knows the answer and they gave it to us in order to give it to you. Unfortunately, because this is only episode 1, we just don't have any questions from you yet. I'm sure we will, but like I said before, it does take some time. So I've decided I'm going to have to prime the pump a little bit in reverse and actually ask the first question myself, and then hopefully some of you guys can step up and answer it. So I was at the NAMM show a couple weeks ago here in Anaheim, not too far from where I'm actually based. And I'm telling you, I'm sure I saw 1,000 guitars, maybe more. I mean, it's a plausible number, and tons of great stuff. I mean, it's cliche, but isn't this kind of the ultimate candy store for us? I mean, it was amazing. But there was something that kept gnawing at me the whole time, and I wondered to myself, can this be sustained? I don't know the answer to this yet, but is it possible that there's some kind of bubble here? And what will this landscape look like at Winter NAMM this time next year? It's an interesting question. If you think you have an answer to it, chime in. Let us know on our website at guitarbusinessradio.com and click participate. There's a lot of ways you can talk to us, and we'll certainly look forward to hearing from you. And you can also ask your own question if you're so inclined, or sitting or standing. But now, here's something completely different. Well, Mark Lacey has been a guitar builder for over 40 years, and between building extraordinary custom guitars and handling many high-end repair projects, he's worked with literally the icons of popular music and jazz, from Aerosmith to Herb Ellis, Jackson Browne to Pink Floyd, Paul McCartney to Stevie Ray Vaughan, and the list goes on and on. He knows a lot, he's seen a lot, and he's done a lot. And Mark Lacey joins us today. Okay, Mark, thanks for coming on the show with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. And also like to say hello to all the listeners out there.
Well,
hope you enjoy our little interview here.
Yeah, it's great. In full disclosure, you and I have known each other for a number of years, and of course, I have a high opinion of you, and that's why I'm really pleased to have you on episode 1 of Guitar Business Radio. So let me start off first with, and you've heard me say this before, that my own opinion is that the foundations we build, for our business as well as our personal lives can really influence our professional path. And you got into the business in the late 70s. And from what you've told me, that period through the early 90s was really a foundational period for you, which would ultimately set the stage for the next phase of your career. And I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of what transpired during those first dozen years or so that created or contributed to the foundation for what was to come next.
Well, I started actually in 1974. Where I attended a luthier school in London. It was a 3-year course at the London College of Furniture and Interior Design, which is now Guildhall University. And I started in building early instruments from Renaissance Baroque period, instruments like lutes, theorbos, chitteronis, citerns, Baroque guitars, viols, all that stuff. Only because there were no vacant places when I applied to the school for the modern fretted.
Got it. I see.
So anyway, halfway through the course, they let me switch over to the modern fretted side. So I got the full gamut in the modern fretted side. I made archtop guitars, classical guitars, solid bodies, flat tops, electric mandolin. I think in the 3 years I made something like 17 instruments.
Wow.
Which was, quite a lot. I was very productive. When I finished college, I moved to Oslo, Norway. My first wife was Norwegian, and we moved up there. And I found a job with Norway's largest importer of musical instruments, and I was running their repair shop because they sold instruments all over the country, and most of the stores they dealt with didn't have a repairman, so everything got sent back to the importer, and we dealt with it.
Well, that's a different way to do it, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and it was kind of odd because they'd advertised for someone for that job in a magazine called International Musician and Recording World. And I had that copy of the magazine the last month we were in England, and I didn't see the ad. So they were advertising that they would send someone over to London to interview people, and I just came walking in the door. So it was kind of kismet, I guess.
Great coincidence, huh?
Yeah, and I got to do a lot of repairs on brands like Ibanez, Gibson, Rickenbackers. I didn't get to do much building. I was there for a total of 4 years. I did manage to make a lute, an archtop guitar for my boss.
But not much loot, though. Huh? Not
flat
much
top, but the rest of the time I was doing repairs or building a house and socializing, all that. Right. So anyway, in 1979, I got a job offer from George Groom to come to work here in the States,
sure,
in Nashville. So 2.5 years later, because of immigration, what it takes to get a green card, I arrived August 7th, 1981, and that was a culture shock. Very different to Oslo. And Nashville was a very different place to what it has become now. But it was a great experience at Groom's because I was exposed to all these vintage guitars, which I hadn't seen before. And sort of in at the deep end and doing neck sets and fret jobs and just everything you could, and you really learned how to repair guitars there because it was intensive. Anyway, 1982, late 82, there was a recession and George had to lay off 3 repairmen. So I wasn't one of them, but around that time I got a job offer from Bill Lawrence, a pickup manufacturer.
Oh, sure. Right.
He was looking for someone to run a custom guitar shop in Hollywood. So I said, sorry, George, I've had this offer and I'm going to take it. So I moved out to Hollywood and ran Bill's shop for probably about a year. And during that time, we were rewinding pickups, but he also had me building some prototypes of some basses and strats and tellies and different things. And then a store around the corner called Voltage Guitars asked if I wanted to come rent some space in the back there, and it was only $75 a month.
Wow.
For a tiny little room to do some repairs. So I moved around the corner. Bill, by then, had moved back to Nashville, and I was there for about 2.5 years doing just tons of repairs. And for a lot of well-known people that used to come in there, from Richard Gere to Stevie Ray Vaughan to actors and musicians.
All of who probably had some very demanding requirements, I would imagine, huh?
Yeah, and I also did a lot of work for the Hard Rock Cafe. I made them a special guitar, but I also made the mounts to hang a lot of guitars in, I think, 7 or 8 restaurants. So they were just stacked up everywhere, all these signed guitars.
I remember that.
So that was a lot of fun. I'm trying to think where I went from there. Oh, yeah, I did manage to build a few solid body guitars during that time, and they were mostly orders. Couple of flat tops for some people. And then I got a call from George Groom saying that he and some investors were buying Guild guitars and would I be interested in moving to Westerly, Rhode Island and being in charge of quality control. So I spoke to my wife and we decided, it'd be an opportunity, see what happens. So we moved there, and as well as quality control, I was also doing a lot of the preliminary engineering for the new Groom models. George would come up with ideas because he was head of R&D, but I'd have to get them, in production because he was still based in Nashville running his business. That lasted about 9 months. Factory work wasn't really for me.
That was kind of a grind, you're saying. Really.
Yeah, I didn't like getting up at 6:30 every morning and putting in the hours. I'm kind of sort of independent guy, I guess. So we decided to move back to LA, and I went back into Voltage briefly for about 9 months until a store became vacant next door. And I borrowed a little money to cover first, last rent, and put in alarm systems, some security gates, and opened a repair shop. It was about 1,400 square feet, a lot more than what I was used to. And I wasn't long before I had more repair work than I could handle, so I hired a couple of guitar, repairmen to help me out. One was Bill Asher from Asher Guitars.
Oh, sure. I know Bill. Yeah.
And also Paul Flynn, who's now at True Tone Music, Santa Monica. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of proud those guys went on and made a name for themselves after they spent some time with me. But having some employees gave me, freed up my time to get more into building guitars, which is what I got into this to do in the first place. And so I started to work on some designs for some archtop guitars. And I didn't want to copy D'Angelico, but, I wanted to make something similar that was influenced. So I wanted to have some interesting tailpieces, something a bit different.
And that's something ultimately, as we'll talk about, that you became somewhat known for. Did this, now that we're talking about at the late 80s right now, is that right?
Yeah, late 80s.
Yeah. And that took you up. And then at what point did you end up shifting back to Nashville again? I think, was that the early 90s at that point?
It was 95.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you worked that location, and you were building more, you started building more arch tops at that point,
well, as well as the arch tops, I'd also developed some solid electrics.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't really much anything like that around at the time. I mean, obviously you got semi-solid electrics from Gibson, as far as the 335s, but there wasn't anything that was a solid one-piece body with routed cavities in there with a carved top. And so I came up with the Artist and the Classic model. They're similar looking, but very different. The Artist has a maple top with a standard two-pneumatic bridge and stop tailpiece, whereas the Classic has a spruce top and an arch top style ebony tailpiece or metal tailpiece, and that's more for the jazz players that want an electric guitar as opposed to a full hollow body instrument. And I carried on building those up to 95, and then we decided to move back to Nashville. LA was, it was expensive with the shop rent and the house rent,
sure,
the car payments and everything else. And
everything was.
We wanted to own a home, and it was just a lot easier here. And my wife at the time was working for George Groom because he was involved with the House of Blues that had opened up on Sunset Boulevard. And Troy was running his place that was inside of there. And so Groom said she could work, if we moved back to Nashville, she has a job. And they could also give me as much repair work as I needed as a contractor as well. But it was interesting, within a month of arriving in Nashville, I picked up 10 orders. I picked up a client in Japan who's still to this day orders guitars regularly. And so I was down for about 6 weeks while I built the workshop here in the basement, and then I hit the ground running, and I've been pretty much doing the same thing since.
Well, so that kind of gets me to what you kind of led up to that next major phase of your career as a builder. And I always thought that in many ways you were a pioneer of sorts. So now I'm kind of wondering, to talk about the business a little bit, what was it that worked well for you during that period of time, well into the 2000s, 2010, 2012, 13. So I think we're talking about, 15, 20 years or so. And you had a pretty good following, and you had a lot of repeat orders. So what was the thing that you would say was working really well for you?
I had standard models like a lot of us do, but at the same time, I enjoy challenges and designing things. Some of my repeat customers, like Don Fisher out in Oregon, he was receptive to letting me, do some different ideas. So I made a couple of, actually 3 ornate guitars for him that were a little outside of the box.
Well, yeah, I wanted to talk about those a little bit because, I've seen a lot of your work over the years, and I know firsthand that, you've had the opportunity to create some really magnificent one-offs, and you're describing them. A couple of my favorites are the Delahaye-inspired archtop from a few years ago, and I think that was one of the ones you were describing. And then more recently was that Alfa Romeo-inspired Bat guitar. I don't know, was it Bat 7 or 5 or
5?
Yeah. And so I'm kind of interested to know how those came about and really what it took to produce that kind of an instrument, because you told me a little bit about the details, but I think it'd be interesting to share that.
Well, Don Fisher had some Brazilian rosewoods, some old stuff he'd had for a long time, and he suggested he'd like me to make an archtop guitar with it. And, it's not a wood you normally use for an archtop guitar, but I said, sure. So he sent me the wood. And then I said, well, it would be nice to do something with a theme rather than just one of my regular models. And at that time, there was an exhibit here in town at the Frisch Museum with a lot of Art Deco cars. So I suggested something along those lines, and he said, sure. So I went down the museum and took lots of photographs of all different cars, and there was Bugattis and Ferraris and just everything you can think of. And I ended up picking out the Delahaye because the front grille of the guitar really lended itself to a tailpiece design. So I was wondering, well, how am I going to make this thing? Because it's trying to do it all by hand and all those bars that go through it, it's very difficult to accurately drill holes, angles through metal like that. So I decided to look into having it 3D printed, and I found a company up in Chicago that was willing to take it on. So, I've become very good at drawing three-dimensional objects in the computer because I have CNC equipment. So I drew up the design and sent it to them, and it included the bars that run through it, and they made one up, and it looked great, except the bars didn't look very good. It was sagging, it was just part of the process. So I thought about it for a couple of days, and then the light bulb went off in my head. But why didn't I just have them 3D print the outside frame, but with the holes already in it, so that I could come in and insert bars separately?
And then they would be straight.
Right. So that's what I did, and it came out wonderfully. I was really happy. I mean, it was many hours work and planning, but the results, it was worth it.
Well, it's an amazing guitar, and I would certainly encourage all of our listeners to get a look at it. And we'll give a link to that.
Well, the other features on the guitar were the pickguard, which is aluminum, that was shaped like the front fender of the guitar, and the door handle from the guitar is an interesting shape. I made that up also in aluminum. I machined it here on my CNC, and that went set into the headstock. And the inlays on the fingerboard, part of it is the vents that are in the engine covers that lift up on the sides of those older cars.
Very cool.
And also some of the knobs that are on the dashboard. But it all came together, very well, I think. And it sounded good. Even the rosewood, I was surprised.
Well, that always kind of is the icing on the cake, because it's not a beautiful instrument, but it does play and sound well. So,
my approach with doing decorative stuff on archtops is I don't want to do anything that's going to interfere with an archtop design, and how it's going to function and sound. But you can still, you have a lot of freedom with pickguards and tailpieces, headstocks, that kind of. Anyway, later on, Don wanted a solid body guitar, and so I said, well, how about another car? And he said, sure. So at that time, there was another exhibition at the same museum that had sort of more modern sports roadster cars. And so I went there and looked around, and I picked out the BAT 5. And that was quite a bit of work in the computer to, because I CNC'd the body out, but it had the scoops. And then there was features from the door panels, the red bars that are set in the guitar. And I painted it silver with red bindings to match how the car looked. I also made some custom pickguard covers out of wood called Amboina burl. So all you see is the pole pieces from the pickups.
It's an amazing instrument. I've never seen anything that looks like it or even resembles it. I mean, you see a lot of interesting instruments out there, but I mean, this is really truly a unique instrument. In terms of sound and playability, what was the result in that area?
Well, it was a good sounding guitar. It had a great attack to it, sustain. everything you'd expect. Nice, fairly tight feel to it, but a solid feeling instrument. So many solid bodies you pick up, and they just don't work. Somehow the neck's too flexible, and the strings or the hardware is too bulky, and the strings just don't know how to vibrate properly, or they have a brain, but they just don't work. They buzz, and you can't play them hard. I've handled so many guitars, thousands of them over the years, and there's only a few that really do it for me. A lot I pick up, and it's just like,
So you would say that
it's just another solid body that doesn't do anything for me.
You have a high bar when it comes to standards and quality and all that stuff. And the thing is, now that you're 40 plus years down the road in the business, the world has changed pretty dramatically, even in just the last few years. You've achieved a lot in your time. And the neat thing is that those achievements really reside all over the world now. So, I think we could look at Mark Lacey's accomplishments, and there's a lot out there. But I'm curious, to kind of wrap it up here, what does life for Mark Lacey, guitar builder, look like right now, and how do you see the future?
Well, before I get into that, I just want to talk a bit about how things have changed. When I started advertising, there was just print advertising, and everybody bought the magazines. And if they were interested, they actually sat down and wrote you a letter and sent it through the snail mail, and you'd have to write back. And I, sent some photographs, and it was back and forth. And there was a real interest from the customer if they went, to that length to inquire about it. And then along came the internet, and so now it's all quick emails, and also the number of luthiers out there has really exploded.
Huge.
And it's huge.
Worldwide, too.
The information on how to do this is so much more easily available, and there's more luthier schools out there. And the challenge for everybody now is how do you get heard? Because everybody's using social media.
There's a lot of noise.
To try and get the same people. And there's some incredible work being done, especially now that a lot more people are getting into CNC, and they can do things that you couldn't do before. And just the recent NAMM in California, the booth, they watched the video from the booth, and some of the stuff blows your mind. Now, whether they're making a living doing it, because if you think about it, if it's a $15,000 guitar and they've spent 300 hours making it, that's $50 an hour. Well, by the time you subtract the cost of materials and your rent and everything else, how much you're making in the end. So,
there's a lot of pressure from both imports and all kinds of things that have.
Yeah, so I think it's a lot harder now for people to really make a name for themselves. It takes longer because of all the competition that's around.
Of course.
As far as me going forward, I'll sort of carry on as long as I'm getting any, interest in what I'm doing. I also teach part-time at Guitarcraft Academy. It's part of Musicians Institute. They opened up here about 18 months ago.
That's in Nashville, right?
Yeah. I do a day or two a week, and it gets me out of the house, and I can pass on some of my knowledge. I'm toying around with some ideas for some bass guitars. I've always been a bass player more than a guitar player, and I think there's still some room for improvement in bass guitar design. A lot of them are so heavy, and I think some of the hardware is just way too bulky, adds to the weight, doesn't help the strings vibrate properly. So I've got some ideas there, which I'll work on when I can find some time to do it.
Have you built, I don't know if I've ever seen any Lacey bass guitars. Have you built some?
I built some when I worked for Bill Lawrence.
Okay, so it's been a while, but that would be something interesting to look for.
And experimenting there with, with different bridges and things. But again, it was, Bill was he had some good ideas with guitar design, but he didn't know how to execute them himself. But having me around and Matthew Klein, who we went to school together, he was also involved with Bill at that time. He had both of us just messing around with different designs and just experimenting. And it was an interesting time.
Well, so that's something that we can look forward to and keep an eye on. Well, I think that does it for our time right now, Mark, but I really want to thank you so much for sharing this information and so much of your career here on Guitar Business Radio. And I do want to let everybody know that they can see a lot more of your work on your website at laceyguitars.com. And I hope that they do. And I hope you'll stay in touch with us and that you'll come back and visit us at another time.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
So I would imagine down the road we'll have a few sponsors for this show, but in lieu of that, it's only episode 1. So I thought maybe I could at least put in one little plug for our own business, Guitar PR, which is actually having its 10th anniversary this year. Pretty hard to believe, but so it is. At any rate, if you'd like some more information on what we do, just visit us at guitarpr.com. Now, I hope to end our shows with at least a few ideas or thoughts that you can take with you and that may in some way offer you value for your business or your professional pursuits. You know, we've always dealt primarily with small to medium-sized guitar-related businesses. And, you know, after you've been in business for a while, whatever your business is, you should get to know what works and what doesn't, as long as you stay in business. That's pretty basic stuff. And for my way of thinking, that often has to do with becoming more market-driven than product-driven. I think so many companies are founded on product or service ideas. They put a lot of time into developing the product or services that they believe in, passionately in so many cases. And unfortunately, that passion can have a way of obfuscating or hiding what will ultimately become the more important factor in the business, and that is, does the market want this product? I've seen plenty of examples of good folks trying to answer the question that was never asked. That doesn't mean that innovative ideas that people have not even imagined before have not emerged in previously uncharted waters and become wildly successful. It happens regularly. But in the larger scheme of things, I think those are really the exceptions. More often, the case ends up being a lot more about trial and error, doing what you have to do in order to stay in business, and hopefully figuring out what your customers will buy from you, and doing that in time to create a foundation for your business that will allow you to sustain it. In any of those situations, one of the things business owners and operators don't spend a lot of time on is market messaging. I mean, who better to speak for the business than the person who created it? That's often the rationalization. But the problem with that is many business creators are so close to their business and are so influenced by their passion for what they're doing that when they try to put their message out to the markets, it's often skewed in the direction of what they think about their product or service and not necessarily what's going to move the markets in their direction. I've seen this over and over again over the years. It's common. So a couple of ideas I try to instill in folks are, first, spend time looking at your market and your customers. Spend the time to understand what people are buying and what they want as best you can. It may not be as fun as creating products or services and doing the stuff that got you into it in the first place, but somebody's got to do it. The other thing I stress is simplification. Simplify everywhere and every way you can, knowing that you can always and easily complicate things. We do it all the time. Seems to be kind of human nature of sorts. You know, there's really a simple formula that we use in everything that has any kind of marketing component to it. I call it simply the 3 C's. 1, capture the attention. 2, convey the message. And 3, compel the action. I don't have any idea if this is original to me because, of course, it's so simple. But the goal is to check off each of these boxes. And I can guarantee you, if you do that, you've dramatically enhanced your odds of success. And I know some have said to me, well, Jeff, obviously you've oversimplified. And my response is always, no, That's an oxymoron, in my view. The more common occurrence is to overcomplicate. We do that a lot. Just look around. Now, in future episodes, I'll talk in more detail on how to use the formula and different applications, but in the meantime, I would just say try applying it to something you're doing and see if you can check off the boxes and see what happens. I'd love to hear your questions or comments on any of this, and by now, I think you should already know how to do that. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you on episode 2. And that's it for this episode of Guitar Business Radio. Thanks for being with us. You can stay tuned and stay in touch at guitarbusinessradio.com.